In the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 9-0, that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits the states from denying equal protection of the laws to any person within their jurisdiction. The decision declared that separate educational facilities for white and African American students were inherently unequal. It rejected the notion that public education could be separate but equal, which was established by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. Although the 1954 decision strictly applied only to public schools, it implied that segregation was not permissible in any other public facilities. Considered one of the most important rulings in the court's history, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka helped to inspire the American civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination and segregation on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and gender in the workplace, schools, public accommodations, and in federal assisted programs. The Civil Rights Act also had a profound effect on schools. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education that segregation in schools was inherently unequal, there had only been incremental efforts to desegregate public schools and universities in the subsequent decade. The Civil Rights Act required schools to take actual steps to end segregation, whether it was by busing, redistricting, or creating magnet schools, or they would face losing federal funding. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, was a cornerstone of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. This law brought education into the forefront of the national assault on poverty and represented a landmark commitment to equal access to quality education. ESEA is an extensive statute that funds primarily second education, emphasizing high standards and accountability. As mandated in the Act, funds are authorized for professional development, instructional materials, resources to support educational programs, and the promotion of parental involvement. The Act was signed into law on April 9, 1965, and its appropriations were to be carried out for 5 fiscal years. In the ESEA, there were 6 titles that were the laws that would be followed. Title I, a provision of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, is a program created by the United States Department of Education to distribute funding to schools and school districts with a high percentage of students from low-income families. Title I has received the most attention from policy and lawmakers as it accounts for 5/6 of the total funds authorized by the ESEA. Title II supported school libraries and textbook acquisition for both private and public schools, and it funded preschool programs. Title III, cited as the Adult Education Act of 1966, stated that supplementary education centers and services would receive funding for additional support services to bolster school attendance. Title III mandated education programming even when school was not in session, and it provided for special education-related services in isolated or rural areas. An amendment to the Act in 1968 provided the basis for the Bilingual Education Act and the Education of the Handicapped Act. Title IV allocated $100 million over a 5-year period to fund educational research and training. Title V supplemented grants created under Public Law 874 to state departments. And Title VI provided definitions and limitations related to the law or general provisions. The 1972 Indian Education Act was the landmark legislation establishing a comprehensive approach to meeting the unique needs of American Indian and Alaska Native students. The unique aspects of the original authority have been retained through subsequent legislative reauthorizing statutes. The Indian education legislation is unique in the following ways. It recognizes that American Indians have unique educational and cultural related academic needs and distinct language and cultural needs. It is the only comprehensive federal Indian education legislation that deals with American Indian education from preschool to graduate level education and reflects the diversity of the government involvement in Indian education. It focuses national attention on the education needs of American Indian learners, reaffirming the federal government's special responsibility related to the education of American Indians and Alaska Natives. And it provides service to American Indians and Alaska Natives that are not provided by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. On June 23, 1972, the President signed Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 into law. The title is a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program or activity. The principal objective of Title IX is to avoid the use of federal money to support sex discrimination in education programs and to provide individual citizens effective protection against those practices. Title IX applies, with a few specific exceptions, to all aspects of federally funded education programs or activities. In addition to traditional education institutions such as colleges, universities, and elementary and secondary schools, Title IX also applies to any education or training program operated by a recipient of federal financial assistance. Advocates of Title IX's current interpretation cite increases in female athletic participation and attribute those increases to Title IX. Title IX applies to all educational programs and all aspects of a school's educational system. In the 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court issued 3 decisions clarifying that Title IX requires schools to respond appropriately to reports of sexual harassment and sexual violence against students. Civil rights activists and organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union likewise maintain that when students suffer sexual assault and harassment, they are deprived of equal and free access to an education. Further, according to an April 2011 letter issued by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the sexual harassment of students, including sexual violence, interferes with students' rights to receive an education free from discrimination, and in the case of sexual violence, is a crime. When it was passed in 1975, PL 94-142 guaranteed a free, appropriate public education to each child with a disability. This law had a dramatic positive impact on millions of children with disabilities in every state and each local community across the country. The four purposes of the law articulated a compelling national mission to improve access to education for children with disabilities. Changes implicit in the law included efforts to improve how children with disabilities were identified and educated. Also, evaluate the success of those efforts and provide due process protections for children and families. In addition, the law authorized financial incentives to enable states and localities to comply with PL 94-142. I have only talked about a few of the many laws that affect our education system. I chose the ones that I believe to have issues even now in 2018. We have seen so many times on the news where one of these laws fall victim to budget cuts, misinterpretation, or to those who just don't follow the laws. We battle to implement these laws so that every child will have an education. It is vital that we recognize where these laws started and where they are now.